Hi there, welcome to this build and flight review of this 48-inch wingspan Tomboy Senior. A really great vintage model adapted by David Boddington, and it was adapted from the Vic Smeeds Tomboy of the 1950s. Now this is the culmination of a build series where we've started from the plans right the way up through to the maiden flight, and a few modifications as well. So if you haven't seen that already, have a look in the description below this video and there will be a link to the playlist for all of those build videos if you're interested. I think there's about 18 or 19. But today we're going to be looking at what, if anything, I would do different and how it flies and what I've learned from the flights. Now, as far as the build, this is one of the models that I've changed least by building it. Normally when I get a set of plans, I do a few modifications here and there, but I've done very little to change this. And I have really enjoyed building this model. It was an absolute joy to build. It's been years since I've actually sticked up a fuselage like this, and it really is quite simple to build. Now, the weight of this came in at 730 grams and it balanced absolutely lovely without any additional weight. And I think that was mainly due down to the careful selection of balsa for down at the tail plane, the fin, the rudder, and also, if you can see, there's some carbon fibre rods here, 2mm carbon fibre rods, which are used for the control linkages for both the elevator and the rudder. Now, when David Boddington built this, he said it was tail heavy and he had to add lead in the nose. So I think this careful selection of timber is really good, because it not only got it to balance, but it kept that weight down. And this is quite a bit lighter than the prototype that David Boddington built. So, and it flies lovely, and I think that's testament to the weight really, because we kept the weight down. So that's not really a modification. I guess the modification here is the use of these carbon fibre rods. On the plans it suggests cables, I've forgotten what it's called now, push-pull cables anyway. So that it suggests that as a method, which again itself is going to be really light and probably not much different to this. But if I put steel in or plastic control rods, that would have made a big difference. So what else have I done? One of the things I wanted to do with this, which again has helped me keep the weight down because it's allowed me to get the battery right up behind the firewall, is I've installed or made a small hatch on the underside there, right behind the firewall, and it just screws in with a couple of hex head screws there, and that has allowed me to slot the battery right up close to the firewall. If I'd tried to get that battery in that position from inside the fuselage, that would have been really tricky, and I suspect it wouldn't have gone. I could have got it part the way in because there's a hole there, but I wouldn't have been able to stand it upright right against the firewall. So that hatch underneath has been a real benefit. There is a downside to that hatch, and that is that oil from the engine flows down and under the fuselage and as it flows under we get a little bit of it seeping in. It's not really a problem, and if you're used to diesels and you like diesels, then you know they're oily things anyway. But what I normally do is I'll rip a little bit of tissue and I'll fold it up and I'll put it inside that hatch on top of the battery, and it just absorbs any oil that goes in through the hatch. And every time I charge it I need to take that plate off anyway, because that's where the charging port is, and I just change the tissue, and it's no problem at all. Now the only other thing that I would change is the dowels on the front, and also on the back here of the wing. I wish I'd made them just a little bit longer. I don't know whether you can see, but these elastic bands, particularly on the back here, the elastic bands are quite wide, and particularly on the back here, when you get two bands on, there's only one at the moment, you could do with just a little bit more room, and the same on the front, just a little bit more room on the dowel to get that thick second band on. Does it matter? It doesn't really, it just means it's a little bit more fiddly. But as I said, this is a beautiful build, and I really have enjoyed putting it together and getting it ready for flight. Originally I had to take the wings off to get inside to switch a switch so that we could switch it on. Since I've been flying it a little bit, I've just put a little push, hopefully that will show up there, a little push of wire with a little handle on it, and I just push that in to switch it on, pull it out to switch it off, and that works absolutely lovely. So, and like I say, I absolutely love this plane, and I've been flying it a lot. It's more or less all I'm flying at the moment, and I wouldn't have changed anything else. I have changed the engine since the original build, and a tank that works well with that engine. And you've probably seen, if you're watching the series, you may have seen a video where I talk about changing the engine. The original Mills 1.3 was a beautiful engine and it runs lovely, but I just felt I needed a little bit more power, which the DC Sabre, which this is, which 1.5cc just provides, and it does fly better with this. It doesn't particularly fly that much faster, but it just has a little bit more authority, particularly when it's windy and you're launching it and it's just getting away. Now, one of the things that I thought might be a problem when I was building this was the strength of the wings. I was a little bit concerned about the flexibility in them. I'm used to building things that are a little bit more rigid than this, and if I try to lift the plane up from the wingtips, you can see there is quite a lot of flex there, and also if I press down. And I was really worried that if I come down on the wingtips, it's going to just snap them off. But you can see from this here, this little bit of flight, that actually it goes round on the wingtips here, and I can assure you no damage was done on that landing, if you want to call it a landing. And I've come down a couple of times like that where it's just gone over on the wingtips and not done any damage. And actually I think it's the flexibility of the wings that perhaps partially saved it, with the wings just bending rather than being rigid and snapping. But also I think what helps is having a good, the covering is Orocover, and it's quite strong, it's quite resilient, and I think that probably helps add a little bit of strength to the wing as well. So I've been talking about the build. Now let's have a look and see what we would or see how we found the flying of this model, because at the end of the day there's no point in building a beautiful aeroplane like this if it doesn't fly very well. As I've said, this is great to fly, and I've been flying it a real lot lately. And it's great because it's a long time since I've flown this type of model, this vintage model, and a lot of the stuff I've flown recently with ailerons and more powerful. So this is a totally different way of flying. And getting it set up so it flies nice has been a really good learning curve for me. Now, there are essentially two things that I've kind of been dealing with to get it flying right. The one is the trim, and in relation to the elevator and rudder, and the second is in relation to the engine and the thrust and the prop. Now, with regards to the elevator and rudder, in the build article that comes with the plan on AutoZone that you can download, and there's a link below to get that if you wish, in that article it suggests rudder throws of 3/4 of an inch either way, and the elevator of 1/4 of an inch up and down. Well, the elevator first, I've essentially given the elevator as much as I can. It's a tiny elevator, and I find that 1/4 of an inch really isn't enough, and so it probably gets to closer to not all the way 1/2 an inch, but not far off 1/2 an inch, I think. And I find that is fine. It's not too sensitive, and to be honest, I don't use the elevator that much when I'm flying because it's got a natural climb, and then the engine cuts out and you're into that glorious glide. And again, I don't use the elevator, it just comes down lovely and gentle, and all the time I'm only using the rudder. Now with the rudder, 3/4 of an inch when it's flying, 3/4 of an inch either way, when it's flying with the engine, I find is way too much. It's super sensitive, and you end up throwing it into a rock if you're not careful. So I've dialed that down quite a lot, and it's probably much closer to 1/2 an inch, maybe just a tad under 1/2 an inch. It hardly needs any rudder at all when you're actually flying it under power. However, once the power cuts, you really need more rudder, and I've probably got about an inch either way. So I've got dual rates. As soon as the engine cuts, I flick it over, ready for the glide, and I get that bigger rudder throw. Because you haven't got the air flowing past the rudder from the engine like you have under power. So that is really useful to learn that and to get to know that, because that made a huge difference to how it flew. I mean, the throws that were suggested in the build article were fine for the maiden flight, and it did fly nicely on the maiden flight. But again, just fine tuning to get it right. Now with the engine, you can see I haven't got the, if you've seen the previous videos, I haven't got the 1.3 mils in there now. I've got this DC Sabre 1.5cc, and that just gives me a little bit more power. On the plans, it suggests that this plane is ideal for anything from 1.3 up to 2cc. And I found with the 1.3 it was just struggling a little bit if there was a headwind, and it was just rocked a little bit and it would stall a little bit, and it just, if it was lovely and still, it was fine, but it just took a little bit of care to get it up safely from the ground. Once it was high, it seemed totally different. It was more for the getaway really. But having put this DC Sabre 1.5cc in, it does fly that little bit better, only slightly more powerful, but it's surprising the difference it makes. Like I say, just in that initial first maybe 15 seconds, something like that. Now on the plans, it suggests that no down thrust is needed, and you need 2 degrees of right thrust. Well, I found that I needed a little bit of down thrust on this, because it was power stalling just a little bit, and it was kind of just going away like this. and I put in a little bit of down thrust, and that really helped and smoothed out the flight. I also found it was curving round to the left mostly, and I was correcting that with the rudder. And so what I've done is I've just increased the right thrust a little bit so I can straighten the rudder out, and that's made a big difference. It flies a lot better. I suspect now there's about 2.5 degrees. I didn't put much more on, but just a little bit more right thrust to take away that tendency it had to keep going left. I had a little bit of a learning curve with the props, both with the mills and with this, and I've been through a few different props from, I think I started off at perhaps 9.5, then 9.4, then 8.5, and now I'm on an 8.4, and I find that the engine's revving higher and it's running a lot better with that size prop. I may change it again, who knows, but that seems to be a good combination. And essentially that's all I've got to say about how this flies and the trimming and the changes that I've made. But it really is, I can't express how much I've enjoyed this build series and getting used to flying this plane, getting to know this plane, because with any new plane you kind of need to get to know it and what else you need to, what you need to do to it to make it fly just right. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this build series if you've watched it, and if you haven't got a Tomboy, you haven't built one yet, then I can highly recommend building these. It's such a brilliant way of flying, and it's a very lazy kind of day kind of flying where it just powers up to a height and then your engine cuts and it just comes down nice and slowly with a glide and trying to get it onto the strip. So anyway, thanks very much for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed watching these videos.